On today's World Insight, all 164 WTO members except the U.S. back former Nigerian finance minister to head the organization. Why has the U.S. decided to spoil the consensus? And with Americans heading to the polls on Tuesday, how will nations around the world react to the result? I talked to British scholar Martin Jacques to find out more.
Europeans have felt less and less good, less and less comfortable about the United States.
Here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. After 2 months of interviews and consultations, the World Trade Organization's General Council has finally made its final choice and recommended Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala of Nigeria as its next Director General. By doing so, Okonjo-Iweala would become the first woman and first African to lead the WTO. The WTO has called for a meeting on November the 9th after U.S. presidential election to discuss the issue because the U.S. has denied the recommendation. Can the U.S. unilaterally stall the WTO chief's appointment? So what damage would this bring to the world? Let's ask our panelists from China, the U.S., and the European continent. For the discussion on WTO's chief's appointment, joining us in Washington, D.C., Jeffrey Schott, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Long time no see. Good to see you again, Jeffrey. In Beijing, Adam Dunnett, Secretary General of the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China. Good to see you, Adam. Last but not least, in Beijing, Li Yong, Senior Fellow from the China Association of International Trade. Mr. Li, good to see you. Let me start by asking you, Mr. Schott, about the latest discussion regarding the WTO appointment. Tell me, why do you think the current administration is blocking, or rather disagree with the proposal?
Well, the U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer issued a statement and said that he strongly favored the South Korean trade minister because she has experience in trade negotiations, and he feels she is the most qualified. Both the remaining candidates are very well qualified, but what seems odd is that the selection process, could not come up with a consensus and yet still announce that they had a clear favorite. That's what I think has thrown the decision-making process into turmoil.
Mr. Li, according to some media reports, the latest dispute about the future selection has a lot to do with China. Well, everything these days in the story has something to do with China, but Mr. Li, what is your take about these kinds of rhetorics in the media reports?
Probably has something to do with China, but basically I don't think China is the main or the only reason for the U.S. to block the nomination. And obviously, this Nigerian finance minister, actually she has dual citizenship. She is actually holding the U.S. citizenship. But on the other hand, she seems to be a kind of a doer, supporting strongly the WTO's multilateral system. And he specifically said the multilateral trading system is good for the world, and she doesn't want to see, or she wants to see less of bilateral spat that we see. So because of her position, and because also her focus on the the development of African development, probably this is not in line with the U.S. Idea of changing the trajectory of the WTO, into the direction of what U.S. wanted to have.
Interesting. So, Mr. Dennett, what about from the European side? I know you are representing the European Chamber of Commerce here in China. When you're talking to your business friends, what do they have to say about the latest debate?
Well, the European Commission and all of the member states have all unanimously backed Dr. Ngozi. They think she'd be a strong candidate, should be the first female, both would be the first female Director General of the WTO, but it'd be the first African Director General of the WTO. So they think that would be very good for EU-African relations, but she, unlike her counterpart, she's got a much wider experience. She's an expert in development economics, and she's got a strong finance and customs background, and so she's certainly the outsider in this case. She doesn't have the trade experience that her counterpart does in terms of trade negotiations and all that, but both very strong candidates, and as I think one of the other panelists said earlier, she's probably more likely to shake things up, but the concern about her pro-trade tendencies could perhaps be the concern for the U.S. that's done a lot of work recently in raising issues that it's not satisfied within the WTO.
So the question fundamentally is whether it is about her or it is about a vision for the World Trade Organization and the potential of global trade, Mr. Shaw.
Well, clearly both of the candidates believe in a very strong multilateral trading system. So there's no difference between them. And the Korean trade minister, her hero is Carla Hills, who was the former U.S. trade representative, who was one of the strongest supporters of the multilateral trading system. So I think what the problem is that the Trump administration has a very peculiar view of what it wants to do. And they may be in office for the next 4 years, or they may be out of office by January 20th. And so having reached a decision before the U.S. election was very, very odd, and was a big mistake by the ambassadors in charge of building the consensus process. And indeed has led to the big mess that we're in now, that nobody knows what to do. And what is going to happen next week and in the coming weeks. It's a big mess, but it has nothing to do with favoring a candidate because of support for the multilateral system. They're both superb.
Politics are always complicated, especially the U.S. election politics, but the rest of the world need to and have to bear that in mind. Mr. Lee, on the other hand, there are a lot of urgent issues that WTO needs to handle. We know there are layers of issues, from technical issues to the governance and structural issues. So, Mr. Lee, from now until the election, the next administration coming in, whether it's the same or a different one, all this time, how should we handle some of the thorny issues already on everybody's top agenda?
You know, without the successful appointment of the Secretary General into position, I don't think the WTO can do anything. And that is, I think, the reason why, you know, for the second time, the U.S. is blocked. One of the main actions that WTO is going to take. You know, the first one is the refusal to appoint, you know, new members to the appellate body. Which almost has crippled the dispute settlement mechanism. And this time, I think if there's no agreement, because, you know, the whole process requires consensus, you know, across the 140 members, theoretically, you know, one single country can block the process. And that, I think, it is going to bring to the eventual voting system. So before, you know, I don't think it has really something to do with the upcoming election, but whoever is going to be in the White House probably is going to make a little difference, but I don't really expect that, because, you know, whoever is in the office is, you know, they are going to handle the burning issues domestically and some of the major international issues, whether WTO is going to be on top of the agenda, because, you know, for the Americans to make a compromise on their decision, is going to be a very complicated and difficult process.
Right. Interesting. Mr. Dennett, on the other hand, so will WTO be able to play its role for the foreseeable future? And what does that mean for the Europeans?
It's a good question, Tianwei. I mean, let's be clear that the challenges WTO facing is not just with the Trump administration. This started 15 years ago with the lack of completion of the Doha round. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, the good news is everybody agrees that the WTO needs to be reformed. On the other hand, the bad news is everybody's definition of what that reform entails is quite different, a bit like China in that regard. But there are some areas perhaps that we can find some commonality amongst ourselves, and I think for anybody coming into this role, what you need to do is look towards the low-hanging fruit and look for small wins to move this organization forward, because otherwise I think you may end up with many bilateral agreements like the EU has been doing. They haven't been sitting idle during this paralysis that the WTO has been going. They've been signing deals with Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, and even talking with China on an investment deal right now.
Right. And how is that doing?
Well, politically, on the investment deal, the comprehensive agreement on investment, the leaders of the EU and China have agreed to try and strive for a political agreement at least by the end of this year. It's been 7 years and 30 rounds in the process, but if that could be signed, I think that would send a strong message to the rest of the world that we need to move forward, and EU and China are prepared to do so.
Mr. Jacques, I know you go beyond the national politics, and you are one who really have been looking at the international trade system and been working on it. Tell me more about what can we expect structural-wise, international, more bilateral and smaller size regional multinational frameworks. Will WTO still be relevant in the foreseeable future? And what can be the role of the U.S., which administration coming in office, and vis-a-vis its relations with China, with the Europeans? There are its major trading partners.
A lot depends on the U.S. election. Because a Biden administration would be quite different from the Trump administration in terms of what it wants to do and how it does it in terms of pushing WTO reform. A Biden administration would seek to strengthen the WTO system and other multilateral, other international organizations, but it would do so in cooperation with our trading partners. And that is something that is a little different from what the Trump administration has done. It's put forward reform proposals, but it's always been, this is the way we want to do it, and it's our way or the highway, or we'll leave. So I think the U.S. election makes a big, big difference. There are a lot of advisors to Vice President Biden who have experience and have put forward proposals for rebuilding the appellate body and strengthening the dispute settlement system, and have putting forward ideas for areas of reform in the WTO. But your point is well taken. Not all of the initiatives necessarily will be in Geneva. Some of them will take place in plurilateral initiatives, like we are already seeing with regard to digital trade and environmental goods. Some will take place in broader regional initiatives, like has occurred in Asia with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And we could see an expansion and revival of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I know the United Kingdom has been talking about potential entry into it, and China has been thinking and studying that possibility for a long time as well. A Biden administration, I think, would begin to move the United States back into the Asia-Pacific region and also revisit the TPP. So there are a lot of different ways that the process can rebuild, but I think the Biden administration would put a priority on rebuilding and rebuilding better.
Does China, for example, Mr. Li, which is also a very important part of the WTO international trade platform, believe in a new administration in the U.S. would make a huge difference?
The basic perspectives about what Biden would like to do in terms of reforming the WTO, but the current problem issue that the Trump administration has with the new nominee is, quote unquote, they have really no multilateral tariff negotiations. There's kind of no transparency, and I think it is interesting to understand why EU has supported the new nomination. Because she had a clear priority list, on her agenda if she was appointed the Secretary General. For example, the special treatment differentiation, industrial subsidies, and also dispute settlement reform, which has been one of the issues that U.S. has with WTO, and then the rest would be resolving the issues of fishery, e-commerce, and health. And obviously, Dr. Ngozi, she has a clear mind in terms of where the WTO should go. And in terms of regional development, I think China's focus right now is RCEP, without ruling out the possibility of joining other regional initiatives. But I think the focus really is, to make sure that the multilateral system is going to continue to work, to function, and to help the world trade, because no other regional blocks, whatever it is going to have the kind of a global reach. So WTO is essentially very important, or more important than the regional agreements.
Mr. Dennett, I'm sure you've been listening to your two other colleagues very closely. The name of Europe has been completely mentioned in both their answers. Your take?
I think the EU would really like to support the African candidate because of its history, relations, and what she represents in terms of balance and bringing vigor into the WTO system. All of the other issues, e-commerce is obviously an issue that companies around the world are very concerned about. It's undermining retailers, and so we'd like to see that tackled. The fisheries issues, we've seen progress on that, so that's something that I think could be a low-hanging fruit for her. The dispute settlement mechanism, if the predictions about the U.S. election, about Biden getting in are correct, then I have a strong feeling that as part of his multilateral engagement in other areas, that he'd come back and probably support her as well. And I think one of the failures of the WTO is everybody thought the world would sort of converge in the 25 years since it's been created, but we've seen that there's many different economic systems around the world, and people are, I think, again, a large part of the Trump administration's response to the WTO has been a reflection of how it sees the world not converging and not having the same value-based system that it and other countries have as well. So there's a long history to why the WTO is facing the challenges that it is.
Now, many suggest it is not a coincidence that the U.S. has produced a very unique president. It's also not a coincidence that we see an election that could be very intense, which means there could be support for both camps and different ways of looking at the world within the United States. So how long do you think, Mr. Schott, can people expect really the U.S. come to reconciliation within itself and to come up to a consensus within itself about how it looks at itself, how it approaches the world? This time I want to ask you from a trade perspective, because it's not fair to ask you from a politics perspective. Mr. Schott.
Well, Interestingly, Martin Wolf and I were on a panel last weekend at the Bund Summit in Shanghai, and we were talking about this very concern, that regardless of what happens in the election, there's going to continue to be deep divisions in U.S. politics, and that will spill over and lead to continued frictions in U.S.-China trade relations. Now, how does that affect operations in the WTO? To be very clear, to get anything done in the WTO, the major trading powers have to be able to work together. Not necessarily agree on everything, but to cooperate with each other. And so for the United States and China, we have to work together. We have to find areas where we can make progress and avoid political roadblocks. One of the areas would be in the area of climate change. The trading system needs to be retooled to address, at least help contribute to the issue of climate change. Subsidies are part of the issue. Regulatory issues are another. Another issue is access to medicines. The pandemic has underscored the need to have common disciplines, and the United States and China and Europe need to be working together on that. And a final issue, Dennis mentioned the issue of subsidies. Well, dealing with broad-based subsidy reform is very difficult today. I can tell you I did it 40 years ago, and I wrote some of the international trading rules on subsidies on a broad level. But today, I think the world is much more complex, and we have to focus on sectors.
Yeah.
And one of the sectors that the United States and Europe and China should be working on is aircraft subsidies. It's not just a Boeing and Airbus problem anymore. China has a big stake and has been deploying subsidies in this area. And it's one area where the three could get together and help push a positive subsidy agenda in the WTO that actually has a chance of success.
It's always a fascinating discussion, gentlemen. Just think about all the moving factors for every issue that we've been discussing. Absolutely fascinating. For now, I want to thank for your expertise and also your insights joining us for this discussion. Jeffrey Schott, Adam Dennett, and Lee Yung, wherever you are, be safe and be sound. I hope to see you soon. And you're watching World Insight. Coming up on our program, with Americans heading to the polls on Tuesday, how will nations around the world react to the results? I talked to British scholar Martin Jacques.
Europeans have felt less and less good, less and less comfortable.
You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. On November the 3rd, Americans will head to the polls and send either Joe Biden or Donald Trump to the White House. President Trump turned American foreign policy inside out to the benefit of some nations and dismay of others. Now, both groups are watching attentively to see which direction the U.S. goes next. So what does the upcoming election mean for the world? And lately, I've been talking to Martin Jacques, former senior fellow at the Department of Politics and International Studies with Cambridge University. He's also the author of the book, When China Rules the World. Let's listen to his take about the upcoming U.S. election and its overall impact. So many things are changing so fast every day, but the biggest drama, of course, U.S. presidential election. Do you think Europe as a whole, even though very hard to generalize like that, have any preference between the two candidates?
Well, I think it varies across Europe. I mean, I think the key countries of Western Europe, by and large, are of a like mind, notably Germany and France. They would like to see a Biden victory, and they would like to see the back of Trump. And I think that's probably a view shared widely across the European Union. There are, of course, countries in Eastern Europe, like Hungary, that prefer Trump. And the UK government certainly, although it's not making a song and dance about this at the moment, would prefer Trump.
Very interesting. If I could read some of the latest surveys coming from ECFR, which stands for European Council on Foreign Relations, they had a survey recently that found in a continent-wide survey that even if Joe Biden were elected, it said, voters in France and Germany believe Europe should, quote, maintain good relations with the U.S., but prepare for disengagement. Should Trump win, however, voters in Belgium, Sweden, Austria, and Croatia all believe preparation for disengagement would be necessary. End of quote. Of course, a survey is one thing, eventual strategic choice is another thing, but it's an interesting result.
I think it is a very interesting result, and I don't think it's a surprising result.
Why not?
Because, well, there's a much longer term picture and there's the relatively short term picture. The relatively long term picture, which has really since, let's say, even before the Iraq War, but from the Iraq War onwards, Europeans have felt less and less good, less and less comfortable about the United States. It's been moving, in their view, in a different direction to the one that Europe's been moving. In the shorter term perspective, which is really dates from 2016 and the election of Trump as president, then I think most Europeans cannot identify with Trump, don't support him, and find him unacceptable. And this is, I think this is very common across a lot of people within the European Union. And as a result of that, I think strategically now there's a widespread view in Europe that the relationship in future with the United States will take a different course to what's happened in the past. I mean, really, the great solidification of the US-Europe relationship was in the context of the Cold War. And ever since the Cold War, that relationship has in varying ways been weakening. But really, with the Trump administration, this is something different, because Trump clearly has rejected the idea of the multilateral relationship and the so-called Western order and so on since 1945, and rejected, in a sense, Europe in the process, including the European Union.
If you look at the agenda between the United States and Europe, the cross-Atlantic agenda, one would look at the immediate ones, such as the pandemic, and then the longer-term ones, such as climate change, which Europe as a continent have been quite enthusiastic about. There's, of course, also the international and multilateral mechanism. Both Europe and also U.S. Should play a significant role there. How much common ground do you identify on some of these areas?
Well, on one issue, of course, they are absolutely in opposite positions, which is climate change. I mean, this is over a long period. I mean, go back to George W. Bush and so on. I mean, you know, he rejected the idea of climate change, and this has been a long-running thread in American policy, particularly as far as the Republicans are concerned. And Trump absolutely rejects the idea of climate change. You know, he makes fun of it. He thinks it's a joke, and he has poured, you know, lots of taxpayers' money into the oil and gas lobby in the United States. And I think this is very important to understand this. That this is part also of a wider problem. It's not just the climate change, but there is very powerful body of opinion, which of course is essentially part of the Trump bloc, which is sort of anti-science. You know, there's an irrationality about it. And this is a very important thread, which is not discussed enough, actually. In American society, there is a kind of anti-enlightenment bloc of opinion. You can't understand the emergence of Trump, you can't understand the support for Trump without recognizing this. And it is a very powerful steer on what happens in America, as we can see.
How that also transforms the interesting way of handling the pandemic also in the U.S. And as a result, where is Europe, where is the U.S. on the controlling and prevention of COVID-19? We see apparent differences. How do you see these choices, approaches? How will that, in a way, help the two sides to outline the future they could have, and therefore have an impact on Europeans' perspective about this election?
Well, of course, the pandemic, Trump's handling of the pandemic is an important illustration of the point I was just making, which is that he rejects the idea of. I mean, his position is in many on the pandemic is in many ways sort of fantasy land. He doesn't accept the science. He talks rubbish about the nature of the virus and how to deal with the virus, and it doesn't exist anymore, and this drug works and it doesn't work, and all this kind of thing. We've seen all of this. But I think that on the actual handling of the pandemic, basically, I'm simplifying here, you've seen three approaches to the pandemic, globally speaking. First of all, you've had China and what I'll call the Confucian societies like South Korea, Japan, and so on. And their attitude towards the pandemic is to eliminate the pandemic. You don't learn to live with it, you eliminate it. No tolerance, zero tolerance. And they've been very successful along that path. China's been brilliantly successful, but so South Korea and so on. So that's the first position. The second position is essentially the American position, which is what matters is not the virus, not the pandemic. What matters is the economy. What matters is not social discipline and collective responses, but individualism. Do what you like, individual liberties. And the European response is somewhere between the two. Generally in Europe, what's happened is that, there's no strategy, really. They don't know how to handle it. So as a result, they blow hot, they blow cold. They go down to lockdown, they ease the lockdown. So it comes and it goes. And at the moment in Europe, we're having a big second wave now. So we're going back to where we were in the period March, April, May, essentially. So this is a different approach to the United States, but it's not like the Chinese or the South Korean approach. Mm-hmm. So in effect, Europe has certain commonality with America in that we are in practice learning to live with it and praying one day there'll be a vaccine. But it's not the same as the American position. The American position is the outlier because the American position under Trump, anyway, is, let's move on. Life is normal. So what? It's a pandemic. Yeah. 220,000 people have died. Well, so what? It doesn't matter.
So will that change with the new administration coming in? Will a new president and his a team be able to repair some of the earlier weak links regarding, for example, public health and the pandemic?
Well, I think on the question of the pandemic, a Biden presidency would take a different position. I mean, it would take the virus seriously, and it would take the need to introduce measures, of course, social distancing and wearing masks and so on, and emphasis on public health and so on. It would take a much more serious position than Trump has done as the president. Mm-hmm. So I think that we would see a significant difference, and you can see that anyway. I mean, from state to state, because the states matter in the United States. Some states, like California and so on, have taken a very different position. New York took a very different position, for example. Whereas in the Midwest and the South, they were by and large often closer to Trump's position. So I think we'd see, a significant change of atmosphere on the question of the pandemic. More generally, I think that America is in a new place. It's very divided. It's become increasingly polarized. Therefore, governance has become ineffectual. Race and great historic problems have once again risen to absolutely the mainstream political agenda. And I think that America is a very, very troubled country. And I don't see the election resolving that question. I mean, America is now more divided than probably, well, certainly in my view, since the 1890s. That's a long time. That's over a century.
Given that division you just mentioned, how much hope do you think the Europeans as a whole, once again, this is very much a generalization, have about be able to work with the U.S., whoever coming into the White House this time, on multilateral platforms and international governance, such as the UN, such as WHO, such as WTO, regarding trade, public health, and many other issues? How fast will a new president adjust?
In some areas, like the pandemic, like the WHO, I would expect a Biden presidency to want to involve itself in a multilateral way on the handling of this. So I think America would become a full-hearted member of the WHO and wouldn't play the kind of game that Trump has played. On trade questions and so on, that I think, to use an English phrase, Biden's going to ship some Trump water on this. Means classically the Democrats have been more protectionist than the Republicans, and the shift on, hostile shift on trade towards China, I think it's been essentially bipartisan. So I think on those kind of issues, Biden won't be so different from China from Trump. Maybe less abrasive, maybe a little bit more conciliatory in some respects, but on the substance of questions, not so different.
Mr. Jacques, earlier the concept was, or the logic was, oh, let's do business with China, but let's seek security from America. Is that still going to be the logic leading up to the election, and also even after that, whoever in the White House?
Well, I think that Europe is in a different position on China to the United States. And the reason for that is that the American angst about China is driven now primarily by its desire to stop China becoming, the new number one or the hegemonic rival to the United States. Now, Europe does not have that concern in the same way, because Europe has no longer any pretense or aspiration to regard itself as a hegemonic bloc or a hegemonic power. So I think that Europe and the United States are coming from significantly different directions on China, but there are commonalities between them. And I think one of the overarching commonalities is how to deal with something beyond the point they don't understand properly. And China is such a different place to any different country, different culture, different history to what they're familiar with in what has been, for so long a Western world. And I think that both of them are, in their different ways, struggling to understand that, and Europe is certainly part of that.
If there has been a lot of assumptions about the policies, whether it's a change of administration inside the U.S., or whether there will be a so-called like-minded alliance against China, create a common enemy and be able to work on that as the common ground. Do you see that as a possibility?
Yes, I do. I think that the change on China policy in the United States was not simply a function of Trump. I think that would be an illusion. I think that the question of hostility towards China had been building up before the 2016 presidential election, right. And the roots of it were in particularly the Midwest, and a strong working class reaction against the essentially stagnation of living standards that they suffered for several decades. And China, and they could see that, the argument that China was at fault for this, or was the cause of this, accorded with the fact that when their factories got closed, you know, an American multinational might have moved the work to China or something like that. So there was, you know, so that it was a popular move, and it combined with the fact, of course, in the American establishment, and this is across the board in varying degrees, that they'd got China wrong, that they had underestimated China's capacity to rise, and that rise would be successful, and it would not. It would remain, as I've always argued, it would remain very Chinese and distinctive, and would not become like a Western society and so on. And suddenly the Americans came round to this point of view at the level of the establishment, and that, you know, fueled this new Cold War mentality that we've seen since 2016. Now, I don't think that a Biden presidency is going to roll that back.
Very interesting, certainly, to have your insights as always. All the best wishes, Martin, and we're looking forward to the results of the U.S. presidential election. Certainly that will have an impact on how the future is likely to be shaped. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Be safe.
Thank you. Great to talk again.
My exclusive with Martin Jacques. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.